exam. All the kids at college are having their midterms next week, so we're going to have one as well. And I'll give you the assignment at the end, okay, as to how to prepare for next week. But say that again. I hope you do. I hope you come back. All right. But Nehemiah chapter 13. Let's jump into this. This chapter should take 6 weeks, and we're going to do it in one, because there's a lot packed into this chapter. Standing by our promises. That's the title of chapter 13, Nehemiah. Last week, we were here looking at Nehemiah chapter 12, and we saw a great celebration. You remember that? We had the chart of the wall up there on the screen. Great celebration, the dedication of the people, dedication of the wall to the glory of God. And that's what this book primarily was all about, at least the first 6 chapters. Nehemiah had led the people right up on top of the walls, and Ezra, he had Ezra take half of the choir and half of the group up one side of the walls, and then he himself led the other group up on the other side, and up at the very top of the wall, they've encircled the entire city of Jerusalem with these 2 groups. And remember that there was a choir, 288 vocalists up there with instruments singing and praising God. And they were all up there together. And then the whole streets down below were filled with all the people of Israel, praising God, singing praises to God for all that He had accomplished. And that was the focal point. It was God's work that had been accomplished, that they were singing praises to, that in building this great wall. Such a wonderful ending to everything that's happened. And it says there in chapter 12, remember that they were singing with such joy that they could be heard for miles and miles and miles away, with all the praises and all the music and all the singing. What a way to finish. All's well that ends well, right? Well, let's read chapter 13. On that day, they read in the book of Moses in the audience of the people. And therein was found written that the Ammonite and the Moabite should not come into the congregation of God forever, because they met not the children of Israel with bread and with water, but hired Balaam against them, that he should curse them. Howbeit our God turned that curse into blessings. So that's how it starts. After all this joy, after all this praise, after all this excitement and happiness there in chapter 12, the celebration, after all of that, right away chapter 13 starts on that day. And he's referring back to chapter 8. In the beginning of the revival. And they read it in the law of Moses, and part of that reading in the law of Moses was this issue about the Ammonites and the Moabites. And God had said, they shall never, never come into the house of the Lord. They will not be part of you. Oh. But let's look at this for just a minute. Nehemiah, his first term as governor, lasted for 12 years. You see that back in chapter 5 and verse 14. After which then he had to return to the palace. Everything here now is done at the end of chapter 12. So Nehemiah is not here in chapter 13 in the beginning. He had to go back to the king in Babylon, and he had to give a report about what's been going on. And the work primarily has been done. The walls have been built. And so Nehemiah in these first 12 years as governor, and now he's had to go back in chapter 13, verse 6. In all this time was not I at Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, came I unto the king, and after certain days obtained I leave of the king. So he went back to give his report to the king. And then he was there for a certain period of time, and then he got permission to come back. And that's what's happening here in chapter 13. So he wasn't there for quite some time, and most people believe it was at least a year that he was absent from Jerusalem. While he was gone, perhaps a year, only a year, after which he returned to the palace to report to the king. He was gone for perhaps a year, but when he returned to Jerusalem, he discovered that the situation had deteriorated dramatically. For the people were not living up to the vows that they had made back in chapter 10. Remember that? Chapter 9 was that long prayer of confession. Chapter 10, the people said, we're going to do this. 84 of the leaders sat down and wrote out a covenant promise to God. They put their names to it. They signed on it. We're going to do this for God. And they repented, confessed their sin, and declared that they were going to obey the word of God. Within a year, just within a year, they failed. So seeing this in Nehemiah, when you think about this, just pause for a minute. When you think about this, it helps me understand the concern that many of our missionaries have when they have to leave their fields to come home on furlough and report. A lot of our missionaries don't have somebody to pick up the slack. They're afraid to leave. What's going to happen to these people while I'm gone? What's going to happen to this ministry? And we hear that burden from Seth and Amy when they come home. And that's why Seth doesn't want to be here longer than 3 months or 4 months at the most. He's afraid what's happening back there in their home back in Africa. And so many missionaries have that same fear. And they don't know what's going to happen. They don't have strong leaders back there to cover for them in their absence. And so many of them come and they just stay a short time. It used to be when missionaries came home on furlough, they would come, they're there for 4 to 6 years, and then they'd stay for a year over here and try to make the report. And many of them don't do that anymore. They'll stay for 3 months, 4 months, and then they've got to get back. They're afraid for their people. And some people, some missionaries, they just don't take furlough. In today's age with technology, it's a little bit easier because we can Skype and we can get acquainted, we can stay in touch and in contact, so it's a little bit easier, but it's not the same. And we need to pray for our missionaries, especially those missionary wives. They're there by themselves. They don't have the family support, and they need it. Those girls need their moms. They need it. Without spiritual leadership, God's people are prone to stray like sheep, and that's what we're seeing. One successful pastor said this: if we didn't keep our eyes on this work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, it would be invaded and soon fall apart. And I believe that. I believe that. You talk to a lot of our pastors and retired ministers that come home, and they would agree with that statement. What happened with Moses? Remember that? He was on the mountain only for 40 days, as talking to God and getting the law directly from God. And what happened? We know what happened. We know what happened. The people built themselves an idol, became idolaters. The Apostle Paul would establish a church and leave it in the hands of elders. There in the book of Acts, and pastors teaching us through the book of Acts. And then after his departure, soon trouble would start. And he would have to write them a letter to try to straighten things out. And some churches got 2 and 3 letters just to try to straighten things out. The church at Corinth was a church all the way through that letter. There was like 20 different issues that Paul had to address in that letter to the church at Corinth. And I handed out some verses to read. Joe, I think you've got this one. Acts chapter 20, verses 28 through 32. Can you read that for us?
Take heed, therefore, unto yourselves and to the flock over the which the Holy Ghost hath made you overseers, to feed the church of God, which he hath purchased with his own blood. For I know this, that after my departing shall grievous wolves enter in among you, not sparing the flock. Also of your own selves shall men arise, speaking perverse things, to draw away disciples after them. Therefore watch and remember that the space of 3 years I have ceased not to warn everyone night and day with tears. And now, brethren, I commend you to God and the word of his grace, which is able to build you up and to give you an inheritance among them all, which you are sanctified.
So Paul had been in Ephesus building the church, establishing the church, and he's leaving. And before he leaves, he brings all the elders of the church at Ephesus together, and he warns them that this is going to happen. Watch. Watch. And time again, even the Lord Jesus said, watch and pray. Watch and pray. After Nehemiah was gone from Jerusalem just a short time, he came home to find the people defiled by compromise. If you compare this chapter with chapter 10 of Nehemiah, when they had made their covenant promises to God, you'll see that the people failed to keep several of those promises that they had made to the Lord. At the end of chapter 10, we saw that. And the first one was this issue of the mixed multitude. And you look at verses 1 through 3 of chapter 13. On that day they read in the book of Moses in the audience of the people, and therein was found written that the Ammonite and the Moabite should not come into the congregation of God forever, because they met not the children of Israel with bread and with water, but they hired Balaam against them, that he should curse them. Howbeit our God turned the curse into a blessing. Now it came to pass when they had heard the law, these people here in Nehemiah, that they separated from Israel all the mixed multitude. And we saw that in 2 places. Chapter 9, verse 28, and then chapter 9, verse 2, and chapter 10, verse 28. Twice here in Nehemiah, they separated themselves. And if you go back to chapter 10, look at verses 28 and 29 in chapter 10. And the rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the porters, the singers, the Nethinims, and all they that had separated themselves from the people of the lands unto the law of God, their wives, their sons, and their daughters, everyone having knowledge and having understanding. And they clave to their brethren, their nobles, and entered into a curse, into an oath, to walk in God's law, which was given by Moses, the servant of God, to observe and to do. They were going to obey. They were going to obey. But here in chapter 13, already, there's issues, there's problems. Now, what's the problem? They had committed themselves to separate from the people of the land, the pagans living all around them. Specifically, Ammon and Moab. Now, who were Ammon and Moab? Where did these countries come from? Does anybody know? Pardon? Lot. Ammon and Moab were nations that grew out of the incestuous relationship that Lot's 2 daughters had with Lot after the fall of Sodom and Gomorrah. And those children that were born to those girls, the daughters of Lot with their father, became these nations of the Ammonites and the Moabites. And they were arch enemies of Israel from that time forward. And when the people came out of Egypt, as we saw, somebody's got Deuteronomy 23. Okay, Deuteronomy 23. Read that for us, verse 3 and 4.
An Ammonite or a Moabite shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation shall they not enter into the congregation of the Lord forever. Because they met you not with bread and with water in the way when ye came forth out of Egypt. And because they hired against thee Balaam, the son of Beor or Bethor of Mesopotamia, to curse thee.
Somehow, part of this mixed multitude had infiltrated now the Jews in Jerusalem. And they'd been invited in to mix with the people of the Jews. And God said, don't do that, especially these two. And we're going to connect the dots here, because if you weren't here at the beginning of Nehemiah, you missed some of the connections here. Because the people that gave Nehemiah the most trouble were people from Ammon and Moab. And it was Sanballat and Tobiah. And those two enemies, all the way through the first 6 chapters of this book, are what's happening here in chapter 13 in the conclusion. So the mixed multitude had infiltrated the people of Israel in spite of previous purgings. They had said, we will not have associations with these people, but they did. Evidently, not everybody in the group felt the same way. Dr. Wiersbe suggests that the mixed multitude, well, it was the mixed multitude that gave Moses so much trouble. If you go back into Exodus, and all the way through the Exodus, it was the mixed multitude from Egypt that was leading a lot of the division and the complications that Moses had. But Dr. Wiersbe suggests that mixed multitude continues to give the church today a lot of the problems we have in the church today. The mixed multitude. What is the mixed multitude? What's the definition? How do you describe them? Dr. Sarden? Well, that's part of it. But it goes beyond that. Dr. Wiersbe suggests that the mixed multitude, he defines it this way, is composed of unsaved people who want to belong to the fellowship of God's people without trusting the Lord or submitting to his will. That's what Dr. Wiersbe says in today's age is the mixed multitude. They want to be a part of the church, but they don't want to abide by the laws of God in the church. They want to do their own thing. They want to still be attached to the world and love the world. And that's what they're saying. So their appetite is still for the things of the world. And then in Nehemiah 13:2, verse 2 says that they hired Balaam against them. Balaam was a hireling prophet who tried to curse Israel, but each time he saw the curse turned into a blessing. You're going to see this if you go back into Numbers chapter 22 through 24. That tells the story of Balaam. And if you remember those stories, the king Balak of the Midianites had hired Balaam to curse the Israelites because he saw what God was doing with the Israelites in this mammoth crowd of probably a couple million people coming out of Egypt. And he was afraid as they come through his land that they were going to destroy his land. So he hired Balaam to curse them so that he could then attack them. And so Balaam was interested. There's money involved here. He's going to get paid well to do that. You know, and what's the phrase today with all the evil that we see? Follow the money. Follow the money. You hear it on the news all the time. Follow the money. You know, We won't get political, but follow the money. And that phrase is still there. But they hired Balaam to curse them. 3 times he tried. He even went to the Lord and told these delegates from Balak the king, let me talk to the Lord. You spend the night here with me. I'll ask the Lord what he wants me to do. And go back and read the story. It's funny, but it's so sad. Remember, Balaam is the one who rode the donkey. Remember the story? And Balaam gets into an argument with the donkey. You know, it's amazing. It's hilarious, but it's not hilarious. It's frightful. Because Balaam continued knowing God's will, knowing God said, do not curse Israel. And if you try, I'm going to turn it into a blessing. And every time he continued to do that. After God said no. The first time God said, don't go with him. And then the second time, God says, well, you've got it set in your heart pretty much. Go ahead. And that's when Balaam went with the delegates from Balak. And that's when he met the donkey on the road. Or the donkey met the angel on the road. And the donkey, seeing the angel, feared for his life. And God finally, after Balaam has this argument with the donkey, God opens his eyes. And he falls on his face. He says, I didn't know that you were standing against me. He didn't know. God made it clear. Don't go. And now if you're going to go, this is what's going to happen. So the story here in Nehemiah amounts to the mention of Balaam to understand what's going on. Because Balaam finally, without cursing Israel, cursed Israel. You know how? It goes back to what Samuel said. He told Balak, the king, to invite your people to just be friends. Be kindly to them and invite them. And then once they're in the land, invite them to your worship services. And they might invite you to yours and get to commingle and intermingle. And as they're so generous neighbors and friendly and kind, these people aren't so bad. We can mix and mingle. We can get along. And that's what happened. And now they're back in Jerusalem, and God said, don't get involved. Don't sell your daughters to them, and don't bring their daughters into you because of what's going to happen, the compromise. And so that's what's happening in verse 2 with this mention of Balaam, the mixed multitude in the church today. The takeaway from that, well, go back to Balaam. When you read there in chapters 24 of Numbers and the story of Balaam, chapter 25 then is the outcome of what happened, because they got involved. They began to mix and mingle and intermarry there in chapter 25 of Numbers, and God cursed them and God punished them. 24,000 people died in Numbers 25. Because of God's judgment. And the mixed multitude in the church today urges us to follow the philosophy of Balaam. Do what the world wants us to do. They suggest that we have to use methods that will attract people to come into the church and the services and lean towards their kind of music so that they'll be interested. Have you seen that happen? It's compromise. Again, Dr. Wiersbe gives this warning. We must not imitate the world in order to try to witness to the world. We must not. We must not. Years ago, Oswald Chambers wrote this. Oh, I'm going way too far here. Oswald Chambers wrote, "Today the world has taken so many things out of the church, and the church has taken so many things out of the world, that it's difficult to know where you are. Are you in the church or are you in the world?" Vance Havner said, "Today the world has so infiltrated the church that we are more beset by traitors within than by foes without." Vance Havner says, Satan is not fighting the church. He's joining the church. He's joining the church. Nehemiah 13 is a prime example of what happens when God's people let down their guard, allow the world's influence to come in and draw them away from the things that they know to be right and holy before God. God's people know the truth. They've been taught. But they allow the worldly influence come in and then begin to compromise. And you start over here where you belong, and then you just give a little bit and give a little bit, and it's called the slippery slope. And we see it in the church all the time. All the time. I know that we're all sinful people, and none of us are perfect, but that can never be a reason to allow the continuance of sin if we truly desire to please God. Ephesians chapter 6, put on the whole armor of God and stand. Stand. But let's look at now what Nehemiah has to deal with. The first thing in this issue of compromise was there's an enemy intruder. In verses 4 through 9, not only were some of the Jews married to Ammonites and Moabites, but there was an Ammonite living in the Jewish temple. Whew. Last week we talked about all the blessings because the people had the revival, they'd prayed, confessed their sin, and the people signed the contract with God, the covenant with God, and they cleansed the temple. They had established that they were not going to let the temple suffer. They were going to do their part. And remember the chambers that were mentioned? Back in 1 Chronicles, David set up all of these rules and guidelines for the temple when Solomon was going to build it. There were going to be chambers. What were the chambers for? They were to receive all the tithes and all the offerings and all of the sacrifices. It was going to take care of, number one, the temple. Number two, all of the servants of the temple, which were the priests and the Levites. That's how they were going to live. And I think I've got, I guess it's down below. We're going to get to that later. But that's what the chambers were for. So all these chambers were cleansed. They were dedicated and consecrated to God for God's use. But look at what happened here. Verse 4. Before this, Eliashib the priest, having the oversight of the chamber of the house of our God, was allied to Tobiah. Tobiah, the guy who gave him trouble and headache and heartache in the very beginning of this book, Nehemiah. And in verse 5, and Eliashib, the priest, had prepared for Tobiah a great chamber, where aforetime they laid the meat offerings, the frankincense, the vessels, the tithes of the corn, the new wine, the oil, which was commanded to be given to the Levites and the singers and the porters and the offerings of the priests. And Eliashib cleaned it out and offered his free rent to Tobiah. Whew. I'm putting myself in Nehemiah's place. And as we're going to see, I'm getting angry. I don't know about you, but I'm getting angry at what I read here. And all this happened, well, let's look at it. Just because a family has been active in the church a long time and has helped build the work is no sign that each generation following will be spiritual. So sadly, we see that over and over again. Or that any generation will remain spiritual. Our children and our grandchildren can drift. We need to pray for our kids from the faith and try to bluff their way on the testimony of their parents. Because they've been raised in the church, they've grown up, they know the stories, they can quote the Bible verses, they have a fun competition, they have a fun time. But is it personal? Have they made that choice themselves for Christ? We need to pray for our kids. We need to pray for our kids. And sometimes as they get out, now they got their own families, and they're not living the way they were raised. And it's challenging as parents to watch that. It's so hard. And so many parents then begin to compromise because they want to stay connected to their kids who aren't living right. And so we begin to compromise. We let down our standards. We let down our guard. It's hard. Eliashib's relative was privileged to be born into the priestly family, yet he threw away his future ministry by marrying the wrong woman. Why did Eliashib let Tobiah live in the temple? Because his grandson had married an Ammonite. And they were trying to support the family instead of supporting God's law. It can create conflict outside of the home. The in-laws become outlaws. It was bad enough that an Ammonite was living in the temple and that a Jewish high priest had let him in, but this intruder was using a room dedicated to God for the storing of the offerings used by the Levites. He defiled the temple by his presence, and he robbed the servants of God of their livelihood. Because everything that was in that chamber belonged to the sustenance and the care of the Levites to feed their families, to take care of their needs, and to provide for them. So what did Nehemiah do? Verse 7, I came to Jerusalem and understood the evil that Eliashib did for Tobiah in preparing him a chamber in the courts of the house of God, and it grieved me sore. Therefore I cast forth all of the household stuff of Tobiah out of the chamber. I went in there and took all of his earthly possessions, and I threw them out in the street. Clean house. And when you read this, it looks like he had to do it by himself. He didn't have any support. It appears that he had to do it by himself. And then I commanded, and they cleansed the chambers, and thither brought I again the vessels of the house of God with the meat offering and the frankincense. And I perceived that the portions of the Levites had not been given them, for the Levites and the singers that did the work were fled every one to his field. What happens when you don't get paid? You got to look for work. You got to provide for your home. So if the Levites can't get what they're supposed to get from God's people in support of the temple, they've got to look for a job. They've got to look for a way to get means to feed their families. So they went back out to the suburbs to farm and to get food. That's what's happened. So they broke their promises already, an enemy intruder. The second thing was the mixed marriages. Verses 23 through 21, or 31 of Nehemiah. Remember back in chapter 10, verse 30, they made this promise: we would not give our daughters as wives to the peoples of the land, nor take their daughters for our sons, but they did not keep that promise. In his survey, remember in the beginning of Nehemiah, in chapter 4, in Nehemiah's initial survey there, as he was looking over the condition of the walls and then the condition of the community, In chapter 4, verse 7, it says that Nehemiah saw women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab married to Jewish men, and he heard their children speaking foreign languages. If these are Jewish people going to a Jewish temple, and their language is what? Hebrew. That's what it should have been. But we saw in chapter 8 at the revival that the people didn't understand Hebrew. This is decades later. They've come back from bondage in Babylon, and they didn't know Hebrew. And so the Levites had to teach them Hebrew in the language that they understood there in chapter 8. And now Nehemiah is saying that I hear all of these other languages. Well, where did the languages come from? From these wives who didn't know the God of Israel, that had intermarried. And we know, I think everybody understands that the children are going to learn more from their mother than they do from the father, for the father's gone away from the house all day long working. In most families, the mother has more time with the children than the father does. And the mother teaches, and the children listen to mom. Now, I'm not going to make that a blanket statement because godly homes, the father's involved. And the father understands his responsibility, but not as much as what fathers should. We know that. But that's what happened. So Nehemiah hears all this stuff. So somebody has 1 John 4, verses 5 and 6. Did I give that to someone? Samuel? Read aloud.
They are of the world, therefore speak they of the world, and the world heareth them. We are of God. He that knoweth God heareth us. He that is not of God heareth not us. Hereby know we the spirit of truth and the spirit of error.
The problem is, too many in the church understand the language of the world more than they do the language of God. Because they like the language of the world, they don't like the language of God. Let me read that same two verses from the NIV for you. They are from the world and therefore speak from the viewpoint of the world, and the world listens to them. We are from God, and whoever knows God listens to us. But whoever is not from God does not listen to us. This is how we recognize the spirit of truth and the spirit of falsehood. That's what Nehemiah is facing in Nehemiah 13. Nehemiah dealt with the problem by first expressing his horror that such a thing should be done in Israel. Look at verse 25 of 13 there. In those days, verse 23, in those days also saw I Jews that had married wives of Ashdod, of Ammon, and of Moab, and their children spake half in the speech of Ashdod, could not speak in the Jews' language, but according to the language of each people. And I contended with them, and cursed them, and smote certain of them, and plucked off their hair, and made them swear by God, saying, Ye shall not give your daughters unto their sons, nor take their daughters unto your sons for yourselves. Nehemiah saw the situation. He got angry. I don't suggest that you do this. You don't walk over to a chick and grab his beard and rip it out. But that's what he did. He's walking down. He's so angry with their sin and their compromise. And he smote some of them, just smacked them upside the head. You disobedient rebel. I mean, look at that. That's what he says. Now, it doesn't say that God approved of his actions. And later on, Nehemiah even goes to God and he says, God, forgive me, you know. But he's so frustrated. He's so angry. My goodness. I smote certain of them. I plucked off their hair. I made them swear by God, saying, you will not do this. And then he gives them a sermon. Look at verse 26. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin by these things? Yet among many nations there was no king like him, who was beloved of his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, even him who had that relationship with God, and we could spend a whole session just on Solomon's relationship, even him did outlandish women cause to sin. They compromise. They compromise. They compromise. The law of Moses was clear, but both priests and the common people had deliberately disobeyed it. So Nehemiah then purified the priests, made certain that only those who were qualified served in that capacity, and how important it is that we take a stand for separation from sin. Go back to Ephesians 6, and having done all, stand. Stand. We've run out of time. So we're going to have to finish this next week. So we're going to do that, but this is your assignment, because next week we're going to finish our study in Nehemiah. And when we come back, we're going to finish the rest of these compromises and the breaking of the promises that they made at the end of chapter 10. And then in 11 and 12, what we saw that they did there and the excitement. But then here in 13, while Nehemiah is gone, they broke their promises. And we're going to complete this. They broke this, the support promise. They broke the Sabbath promise. And there's at least two more, and possibly another one that we're going to take a look at. And we'll come back to that. But this is your assignment. I want you to take some time this week if you can. Some of you weren't here when we started. But we're going to go back, and after we finish chapter 13 in the beginning next week, I want to just take the rest of the time and do an overview of all 13 chapters. We're going to talk about what's in there. And I want you to think about something out of each chapter that is pointed for us today that we can apply to our living today. These people are just like us. The issues they faced are issues that we face. We saw that over and over again through this book. And take a look. Go back through the chapters. And write down just one thing. There's many in each chapter, at least for me. But just one thing out of each chapter that God spoke to your heart about that we need to pay attention to even for our living today. Warning or blessing, because they're both there. They're both there. Father, thank you for this study. Thank you, Lord, for your grace, your goodness. Thank you, Lord, for this man, Nehemiah, and his faith and his hunger for holiness, and that your people would live holy. And when they didn't, it made him upset. It made him angry. And it wasn't angry against the people. It was angry because of your holiness. And Father, I pray today that even today, we in our homes would have that same hunger and thirst for righteousness.